Good morning or good afternoon, in whichever case it may be. I'm Mujahid Ramadan, and welcome to Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. And normally, if you listen to us on Police Promoting Unity every Wednesday, thank you for listening in today. And I would like to also introduce our guest for our day's discussion, and welcome back to our listening audience to Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. We took off for a month to kind of recast and look at some of the discussions that we were going to be having. And we're back on the air with you today, and we'll be back on every first Saturday for 1 hour here on KCEP Power 88.1. And obviously, we'd always like to thank our sponsors at the Silver Sage Foundation for their kind contribution in helping to make and keep these discussions going. And obviously, the relationship with Power 88 and the station management here, and of course, our new administrative developer for Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue, which is going to allow for us to do a lot more creative things. So welcome. Today, our discussion on Interfaith Intercultural Dialogues, and as you know, a lot of times the subject around faith, and it's faith and culture, is disparity and economic equality. And our guest for today happens to be a local person you've heard here before on Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue, Reverend Gard Jameson. Along with him is a good friend and colleague. We're involved with the interfaith work of Southern Nevada together, is Miss Dora LaGrande, who's formerly in banking and lending institutions. Now she's in housing and housing development. She's formerly the chair of the Southern Nevada Regional Housing Authority, and currently she's involved with Metropolitan Police Department's Multicultural Advisory Council, where she chairs the recruitment subcommittee. And Dora, thank you for joining us also. And of course, we have our good brother now. The two first guests I introduced were local people here, and some of you recognize. Mm-hmm. Our third guest for the day is Professor Hakan Lok, and Brother Hakan is actually joining us from London, England today. Hakan, are you on the line here today?
I am, sir. I am. Thanks for having me.
Good. And thank you for being here. And Hakan is a research fellow at the Center of Government Leadership and Global Responsibility at Leeds Beckett University there in the United Kingdom in London, England. And we'll talk about the weather in a bit further. Gard, welcome yourself and Dora. Thank you. Both on the line here with us.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And Gard, you're there also? Okay, we're going to wait for Gard Jameson. We will begin the discussion, but we're going to, should be calling in, as a matter of fact. Dora and Hakan, thank the both of you for sharing and taking opportune times. And Dora, part of actually this discussion, I was led to or inspired by something that you actually sent to me via the email during the height of the early post-COVID crisis, a pandemic, and it was dealing with economic disparities among populations of color, or what our financial worth happens to have been. And along with that, I had read an article some time ago in a Fountain magazine. If you're not a reader of Fountain magazine, I strongly suggest that you look into it as a publication. It's published every other month, and you can look it up online. And there's an article on economic equality. That article, and both led me to think in terms of we need a discussion around this, and Dora constantly brings it to our mind. And our friend Gard Jameson, obviously, he just introduced me to a book called Pro-Social, and it talked about using evolutionary science to build productive, equitable, and collaborative groups. So it really talks about economics. But Dora, in terms of faith and Hakan, but the Abrahamic faith traditions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, as religions, all have a way of looking at justice, not just economic justice, but justice overall. Dora, what about that in Christianity? Does Christianity, being a minister yourself, being ordained yourself, does Christianity invite us to economic justice in all phases, but economic justice in particular in this case? What about that in Christianity?
Well, first of all, I'm not ordained. I'm licensed. So let's get that straight.
Okay.
And absolutely, when you talk about Christianity and economic justice, first of all, we operate from a premise of everybody being equal, freedom, justice, and equality for all. That is more of a Christianity religious theory than it is in actuality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And of course, I know that Jesus talked about that if there's no justice, our other good deeds really can be invalidated just on the fact that we're not giving justice. And again, assalamu alaikum, you brother Hakan. And Islam, how does Islam approach not only justice in particular, but economic wealth and the spreading of economic justice? How does Islam address that?
Well, if you look back the history of Islam, the context it arrived, it was like 1400 years ago. It was against the establishment, and it was really, really attractive to the poor, because at the time in Mecca there was the established wealthy people running entire affairs of the community. So they were gathering all the wealth, whereas you had lots of people very poor, if not slaves. So Islam was hitting the heart of inequality in society. I think one reason why it rapidly expanded in the Middle East and across the world was that the human nature, that everybody wants to have a bit of that wealth, and everybody wants, dignity in their life. Why should one work as a slave whilst the other one enjoying millions and billions?
Yes.
So very essence of Islam was actually addressing the social injustice and inequality.
Yes. Well, thank you, both of you, for your observations. In the Fountain Magazine article, they were drawing from L. Di Matteo in the book All Equal in the Sight of God, Economic Inequality and Religion in the Early 20th Century. And Dr. Di Matteo goes on to note that economic inequality refers to the disparity of wealth and income between individuals or between different groups in a society. According to Di Matteo in 2014, economic inequality occurs primarily as a result of individual differences in access to and utilization of economic policies, institution, education, globalization, and differences in resource endowment. Dora, Ms. LaGrande, here in the United States, we see a substantial amount of this disparity in terms of economic, particularly among African Americans and other ethnic groups, but a wide gap and chasm between African Americans and Caucasian Americans. And I had the opportunity, while thinking in terms of this and researching for it, to go back and look at a book called Slavery by Another Name, the reenactment of enslavement of black Americans from the Civil War to World War II. Very interesting book I would suggest to our reading audience. But Dora, we've had a history of this disparity as it relates to banking, and you've come out of the banking institution and still in some regards are connected to it. How much does this disparity, how does it come about? We know it emerged in slavery, but it still affects us today. What are the dynamics that are affecting many African Americans, that barriers that still prevent African Americans and other minorities from accessing economic capital?
Well, Ramadan, first of all, African Americans are lacking every economic indicator. Those things that people need to live on, like income growth, employment, housing, construction contracts and procurement, sales, consumer spending, interest rates, net worth. We're lacking every one of those indicators. And the reason that I believe that we're lacking those indicators is because we continue to confuse the principles of capitalism with the principles of democracy. Capitalism is a free enterprise system based on competition, and democracy is based on social and political equality. Blacks need to understand.
And so we're lacking in access to the capitalism and social inequality and injustice, and that's going to be another subject for interfaith intercultural dialogue, because when we look at healthcare, when we look at education, when we look at the criminal justice system, we all see that there's this major disparity, in particular how African Americans are impacted in terms of that. Hakan, there in the United Kingdom, there in London and in England, disparities among populations of color and the dominant population, if it's European English people, what does those disparities look like there in the United Kingdom?
Well, I mean, I travel a lot between US and UK, so I am in a good position to compare two nations. Well, we have similar disadvantages in Britain. However, we have slightly better social security system. So we would like to look after the less advantaged members of our community. But the same discriminations and same disadvantages apply to minorities and black community in Britain as well. This is sad, but I think in terms of progression, Britain is quite good at leading social equality and giving equal opportunities to everybody. Yet the problem still persists, I'm afraid.
Dora, here in the United States, in the book Slavery by Another Name, they give observations in terms of African Americans and slavery, but this post-slavery or neo-slavery from, again, the Emancipation Proclamation or the end of the Civil War up until World War II, we find that African American blacks, those who came out of slavery, didn't really access the resources and or was denied the resources of the American mainstream, like the Homestead Act, which allowed for white Americans, Caucasians, who were identified as Americans at that point in time, to get land that if they lived on and worked on the land for 5 to 7 years, it would be turned over to them, allowing for them to build a legacy of wealth that they could turn over to their children. The denial of that to African Americans, how did that affect us coming out of slavery?
Well, coming out of slavery, there were several things that affected us. First of all, you set the slaves free, and that was it. They were free with no resources to operate on, to raise their children on, to do anything on. So that is just one of the components of how we were impacted coming out of slavery. But post-slavery, there's still a lot of things that are impacting us and our ability to grow, and a lot of it has to do with our which is what we're talking about, the economic power in this country, and how we do not duplicate the fundamental principles of buying black like other races do.
Well,
so let me expound a little bit on that. What I mean by that is when you look at the Hispanic businesses, they have 4.4 million businesses generating $500 billion a year with 34 banks with total assets of $104 billion. Their spending power, there are 59.9 million of them, and their spending power is $1.5 trillion a year. Then you have Asians, they only have 1.9 million businesses generating $669 billion in revenue with 75 banks and their total assets of $120 billion and 54 credit unions with total assets of 4.3, and there are over 22.2 million of them that spend $1 trillion a year. And then you have blacks with 2.5 million businesses generating $150 billion per year with 19 black banks and total assets of $4.3 billion and 19 credit unions with total assets of less than $700 million. So they generate roughly, Hispanics and Asians generate roughly $550 billion more. And those two populations generate $550 billion more in revenue than we do in their banks. However, we are number 3 when it comes to spending. While Asians spend $1.1 trillion a year, Hispanics spend $1.5, Americans spend $1.2 trillion a year. And so that tells you right there, we're spending more money than Asians, yet they have their revenue, their businesses generate considerably more money, then something is wrong. And that something is that we refuse, in my opinion, to deal with each other. I don't know how many Asian or Hispanic restaurants you've gone into and seen someone like me or you working in it, but they have a propensity of employing and hiring and even lending to their own.
And so African Americans, really, we contribute to our own economic out of balance in that regard. We're contributing to it.
When we're number 3 in spending, but their businesses generate more money and more revenue, everything, absolutely we are.
Okay. Hakan, in Islam itself, Islam discourages the overaccumulation or what they call competitive capitalism and sees all of the wealth and everything really belonging to God. How does that apply in today's society that we're living in, not only here in the United States, but around the world?
Well, I have this inherent problem with banking system. Very simple example. If you buy a house in Britain, let's say it's £100,000, and if you pay it back over 20 or 25 years, you pay back the lender about £151,000. So this is, according to Maslow, one of your most basic human needs, shelter. So why is it that the banks sucking the blood and life out of ordinary people? This is outrageous. We should first come up with a better system, fairer system, because simply to survive, to put a roof on your head, you have to pay the banker almost the value of the property you are buying. So I have this inherent problem with long-term lending or mortgage. When it comes to Islam, Islam is completely anti-interest. So you cannot charge interest. You can form unions, you can lend people, and if they are investing into a business, you share the risk. Mm-hmm. For example, in modern banking in Britain, you borrow, let's say, again, £100,000 loan to start a business. This is your debt. You're going to pay no matter what. You make billions or you go bust. Either way, the bank wants their money plus the interest. This is completely anti-Islamic. So if you are lending me money, you should also share the risk with me. But you see, the banking system, I jokingly say to my friends, I say, devil and bankers get together and they create a civilization and they call it Britain. It is so unfair. And I think the way forward is sort of adopt an Islamic way, non-interest, risk-sharing way of giving credit to people. And Islam is completely against gathering wealth with complete imbalance. In British society, I do lots of cycling in the mountains. When I see those houses, they are million pounds. And you come down to city center and you see how people live in inner cities. I say, how do they survive like this? How do these people sleep? Mm-hmm. Because, those small people, they are working hard, paying their taxes. Yes. Yet, it is the modern version of slavery. 2021 in Britain, you go to inner cities, and I find it hard to digest the inequality. I think the way forward is, I repeat myself again, is interestless, risk-sharing development. That should be the way, and that is what Islam advises us.
And now, necessarily, governments may not, but the religion itself promotes that, and I'm sure in some regards there are some Islamic governments that function that way. Dora, when it comes to banking, how available are loans and access to capital for African Americans? Is there something else that we should be doing? Is there something we should be demanding of government in order to level the playing field for opportunities for African Americans? And people have talked about it. We've had opportunities. We've had the civil rights movement. We've had the reinvestment acts. What is it? Where are we missing the mark in? What do we need to be looking for within ourselves and within government? And also, is there discrimination still going on in banking in that terms?
Well, you know the answer to that question because banking is based on competition as well. And competition itself breeds team allegiance, which produces racism. And first of all, we've got to stop continuing to count on government. We're getting back to that social and political equality while we're living in a capitalistic society. We have got to start functioning under the fundamentals of capitalism and not socialism and politics. Politicians are essentially bought and paid for by businesses, by all of the businesses. And so if we're going to ever come out of this, again, like I said before, we've got to get to a point where we are operating in a manner where we are developing and funding our own businesses, developing and funding our own banks, supporting those banks. We continue to go to bankers who continuously say that you don't have enough capital, you don't have capacity, you don't have this, you don't have that, you don't have the other. Well, not one person who started a business had capacity. Capacity was developed. It was developed, and so no one was born with it. However, they get grace where we don't. And so that's why with the Hispanic banks and the Hispanic population and the Asian population, with them having all of those banks, they can go to those banks and those banks will loan them money to start their business. That's why they're doing so well. We don't have that.
And of course, we invest in banks. Let's look at it historically. I want to just look at a few historical experiences that some have made note have further dampened or reduced or retarded African Americans' access to capital. One thing is that post-slavery, after slavery, in the Confederate state, they introduced laws, and these laws led to higher arrest rates among African Americans, who were then lended out, called convict leasing programs, where big business made a lot of money, a lot of lives were lost among these people who were incarcerated and then lended out to businesses. They worked in coal mines, they worked in all type of industry in the South and mining. Is there some responsibility? And of course, were paid nothing, and many lost their lives. And governments participated in this, and criminal justice system participated in this. Is there any reparation due to those individuals? First, the ones who were in slavery who didn't get any payment for their work, and then those who were abused post-slavery or neo-slavery in the Jim Crow era, where the work was forced in by laws. Is there any reparation due to those populations?
Well, they didn't get any pay for their work. They couldn't own. They couldn't. They weren't supposed to read. They weren't supposed to write. So they weren't supposed to get an education. They couldn't own any property. There are several things that they were prohibited from doing. And while they were being prohibited, the white population was advancing in all of those areas. And we wonder why, and we talk about why we're so far behind. So with that being said, yes, reparations are due not to just them, but to almost all of them, because everybody, because you didn't, you couldn't read, you couldn't write, you couldn't own home, you couldn't own land, you couldn't, there were all those blacks can't do. You're 3/5 of a man, Dred Scott decisions. You have all of those things that put their knee on the necks of black folks that kept them from, advancing as far as we could.
Right. Hakan, there in Europe during World War II, it's been proven that the Nazis and the German population committed horrendous atrocities. We call it the Holocaust. We call it genocide among the Jew population that was there. At the end of World War II, right, the Nazis were responsible, or the Germans themselves, the German government was responsible for reparation to the Jewish population. Is that a balance that African Americans, because our Holocaust lasted here in the United States for 250 plus years, there's no parity there when it comes to those reparations. Should the African American population have access to the same redemption that the Jewish population had as a result of their 12-year Holocaust in Nazi Germany? Would that be a fair equation?
Absolutely. Well, I travel a lot in Europe. One thing I notice, it is going to be very informative for the U.S. audience. In Europe, there is one country where entire motorway network is illuminated. Basically, you got lights all over. That's Belgium. And I thought, well, that's a lot of electricity. Who's paying the bill? And they turned the lights off recently. And I was told that Germany was paying Belgium all the damages they inflicted during the war by accepting to pay them in electricity. So now there is peace, because if you cause harm to anybody, or if you have gained any profit from anybody's work, well, I'm sorry, you have to pay it back. Mm-hmm. Before you face the divine justice in the hereafter, if you believe the hereafter, well, you don't need to wait that far. You have to pay back here. I will tell you how justice is established in the Islamic context. If you abuse somebody, you can just go to him and ask for forgiveness. And the Prophet said, well, you pay him back first what you owe him, then ask for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. But you see, there is this misunderstanding. They said, well, I'm sorry, we have abused you and we have profited from your work. Please forgive us. That is not the Islamic way to ask for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. First thing, you pay the compensation. You say, look, I made X amount of profit out of your work or your father's work or your grandparents' work. Here is the money. Now, please do accept my apology. This is the correct way of doing it. And for this, you don't need to wait the divine court. You have opportunity now you have the wealth now, and you know what happened. So pay them what you owe them. So I think in this sense, German example is a good example. Germany is setting a new standard in terms of human rights and paying back the damage they cause. It's a very good example. I think the U.S. should take Germany as an example and pay back the rights of those peoples, rather than just saying, oh, we are sorry this happened. No, you pay back, then you say you're sorry. That should be debate.
That sounds reasonable, Gard. I understand Professor Gard Jameson, Reverend Gard Jameson has joined us. Gard, you're on the line with us now.
I don't know about Reverend, but I'll take that.
Okay, then good. Thank you, Gard, for joining us from the Interfaith Council of Southern Nevada, and a lot of other work that he's involved in here with dealing with health care and feeding the homeless and many other things. Thank you, Gard, for joining us. Gard, Hakan was just speaking in terms of Germany's responsibility they responded to in terms of reparation towards the Jew population there and others. Here in the United States, the Caucasian white population hasn't even been willing to even indulge in a conversation around the slavery as an institution and the post-slavery treatment. Where are we missing the boat here in the United States?
Well, I think it's education. And, I think that a lot of people in this country have yet to recognize that systemic racism, or the caste system, as Isabel Wilkerson has said it, is in play, and it's still in play. And until we have that conversation, it's very difficult to get to where Germany is right now, which I laud and I appreciate. But people have to wake up to the realization that systemic racism is not a theory, it's a fact.
That
conversation has yet to happen.
And to all of the panelists here, is there a need for conversation? Do you think by engaging in conversation and sharing the historical experiences of this country, this will help, one, clarify the need for social justice and reparation, and what's wrong with the population that doesn't want to talk about the racial injustice of America? Dora?
Well, Ramadan,
Okay, I'm getting some static from someone. Okay, go ahead.
Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, she talks about how it's hard for people to accept. And, people here celebrate the Holocaust. You and I just went to an event a couple of weeks ago at Metro. And all over this country, they celebrate it and they talk about it, but they don't want to talk about slavery because it happened in this country. It happened by white folks in America. Therefore, continuing the systemic racism that we experience in almost every aspect of American society. And so people want to sit down and understand the plight of African Americans, then we're always going to be where we are.
Gard, you mentioned Isabel Wilkerson, and to our listening audience, I would strongly recommend not only you read Slavery by Another Name that's by Douglas Blackman, but Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origin of Our Discontent. Gard really gives some comparisons to the conditions of systemic racism in this country and what we know as the caste feudal system we know of in India or we knew of in early Europe. But in the United States, we're not even looking at this matter. And does this caste system continue to perpetuate this economic inequality?
I think we need to understand the word caste. We need to look at India and how they have created economic inequality and disparity as a result of the caste system. We also need to look at the whole neoclassical economic theory, which basically, according to Adam Smith, is based upon and is founded upon selfishness. When you put that together with a caste system which basically denies equal access and equal rights, then you've got all of the ingredients you need for the quality of disparity that we see in America today. So Isabel Wilkerson has done an incredible job at identifying that. She went to India, she looked at the caste system there, and she said, OMG, it looks like we've got it here in America, and we've had it for 400 years.
Yes, and I've enjoyed, thank you for referring the book to myself and sending it to me, as a matter of fact. I've enjoyed the reading and cannot put the book down. It's in some regards revealing, alarming, and very painful. But I think it's information that we really need to know when we look at this comparative analysis. And another book that I would also mention would be Buried in Bitter Waters, written by Elliot Jaspin, and it's the hidden history of racial cleansing in America, which really is all part of this whole economic inequality. Hakan, Gard spoke. Go ahead.
Can I jump in on that a little bit?
Please, go ahead.
Because we talk about the caste system, and in regards to that, we also, you have to look at what people consider to be white supremacy. It's not a group of Ku Klux Klansmen. When you look at white supremacy in America, you have the five largest white banks in America control 80% of all of the deposits. The Fortune 500 companies, you still have 96.2% of them that are all white. All major utility companies are owned by whites. All of the major defense contractors are white. The major social media companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of those companies are white. All of the major telephone providers, Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, all of the major movie production companies, sports teams, manufacturers of cars, guns, household goods, insurance companies, police officers, doctors, lawyers, House of Representatives, and House of Representatives and Senate, state and federal. We've had one black president in 243 years. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. So those are the things that impact us socially, economically. And we keep kind of going back to the social part of it when we need to start realizing that it's the capital. America is a capitalistic society. And until we start operating under the auspices of capitalism and not socialism and political equality, that we're going to continue to be where we are. Most of our elected officials, they're fighting for social issues. But if you look at just what happened in Texas, the reason that the Texas legislatures went back home was because they weren't getting paid. So it's all about money. And we keep not wanting to address that. You can't live unless you have it. We're not going to be equal because there's no such thing as equality and freedom and justice for all and all of that. That's just a sales job that they've given us. Because you're never going to be equal when the majority of the majority population owns most of the wealth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Gard, and I'm going to come to Hakan, but Gard, I want to come back to yourself. In matters of, we had an earlier discussion, I think, before you joined us, in terms of reparation. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that death does not eliminate the responsibility of businesses that participated, that you inherited a business or you bought a business that had benefited from slave labor or from convict lease labor. Is there some responsibility in government and in business for reparation of those African Americans who were affected by slavery and the post-slavery policies that included Jim Crow, that denied lending that whites would get for homes, that denied opportunities in unions, that all people of color were denied when union was first formed and legislation was put in place saying that unions had to be recognized? Is there some responsibility that a government and businesses have who inherited some of those businesses that exploited black labor doing that? Is there some responsibility of the American population?
Well, as your friend from Europe said, absolutely. But before we get to that space, we need some people to wake up and understand what's going on. We need to take a few of those Republican senators through the African American Museum in Washington, D.C., which is an incredible educational experience, which I believe you were privy to go through that museum and experience the 400 years. And so we've got to get people to get to a place. And, Dr. King, his vision was the intrinsic value, the intrinsic infinite value of every person. And so what we need to, in some fashion, and this, as you know, we do in interfaith work, we need to frame the dialogue as a conversation in which there is not an us-them, in which there is a conversation which is guided by Dr. King's vision that the young white boy and the young black boy can sit down together and have this kind of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is really important, because if we walk in the door with animosity, and I know there's a lot of emotional undertone here, if we walk in the door with animosity, we've lost before we started.
Certainly. And I think I see you advocating for compassion in these discussions, and I really appreciate your leadership there. Hakan, there in the United Kingdom, is there, because when we saw as a result of the murder of George Floyd in front of the whole world, we saw even in London there were pushbacks against the systemic racism that had brought slavery even to England. Is there a continued effort for dialogue in the United Kingdom or in Europe about social and racial injustice and even economic inequality? Is there a continued dialogue going on there? Has the experience of the Holocaust given the Germans something and the Europe something to look at that's giving them a new realization that we haven't come to in America?
I think in Britain we are quite ahead of the pack. I mean, this is really multicultural society. In our current government, we have a lot of people from different ethnic backgrounds, and we just see them as individuals. We try not to see their color or accent or their background. And this is actually what we teach in our schools, because I'll bring a bit of Quranic teaching here. In the Quran, one of the verses say, God created human beings as men and women, as tribes and nations and different colors, so that they get together, they meet, and they learn from each other.
Yes.
This is Surah Al-Hujurat. If any listener is interested, it's a verse in Surah Al-Hujurat. This was the default. So we must be colorblind. We shouldn't see people's color. We should just see their merits. So I think we are promoting this in Britain. Yes, we still have racism, but the system has come to a point where it really protects every individual equally. So I think we are slightly better off on this point. And, well, I'll bring a bit of my research at this point, if I may. I studied the philosophy and teachings of Said Nursi, which shouldn't be mixed up with Edward Said, a Palestinian scholar. But they live more or less the same time. Said Nursi passed away in 1960. He lived at the time of Ottoman Empire and Turkish Republic, and he had a Kurdish inheritance. So when he came to Istanbul, he saw a lot of Kurdish people were very poor. That reminds me of African Americans in the U.S. It's a rich country, it's a big country. When you look at it, there is this discrepancy. Why all people of color are at the bottom of the pile? This was the picture at the start of the 20th century in Istanbul. And Kurds, they said to Said Nursi, we should revolt and fight for our rights, use violence if necessary. And Nursi says, no. We have three problems, and we have to address these three problems, which are still there and which are still applicable. The first one, according to Nursi, is education, because he realized there is inequality in education. He says we should educate all our people so that they are on the level playing field. And the second one, he says, is poverty. Again, this takes us to the first half of our debate. If there is poverty, I'm sorry, there is bitterness, and eventually there is violence. We have to make sure wealth is shared equally, and we teach our people to generate wealth and become reasonably wealthy.
Yes.
And the third one, he says, which I love, he says lack of tolerance is the third biggest problem. He says we should promote dialogue, which is another key theme of this debate between Kurds and Turks in modern context, between black and white and Asian, or you name it.
Yes.
So we should teach our people everybody is equal. We should make sure they are all on the same level playing field.
So Saeed Nursi, Bediüzzaman Zaman, actually, even though he hadn't experienced America, his insight spiritually allowed for him to see what was needed in order to correct the inhumanity of humans among one another. So thank you for that, Hakan. And I want to come back to further insights on Saeed Nursi. Dora, I'm also reading the book Buried in Bitter Waters, Buried in the Bitter Waters by Elia Jaspin. And it's the hidden history of racial cleansing in America. But actually I'm drawing from another article I received on deadly issues Juneteenth did not resolve. 5 facts about the Tulsa the race massacre. And it makes note here that an estimated $2 million in property damage resulted in the Tulsa race massacre. The damage to Tulsa's black community in today's dollars is worth over $130 million. Is there some responsibility that this local government, the state of Oklahoma, and the U.S. government has in making whole those damaging effects of the Tulsa race massacre? And not only in Tulsa, but in Arkansas, in Florida, and in many countries. If you read the book by Elia Jaspin, Buried in Bitter Waters, it really talks about what we call ethnic cleansing that we heard about during the Bosnian events. That word wasn't used before, but the United States also engaged in ethnic cleansing. Is there some responsibility that those people that the government has in Tulsa, the people who were there are dead now? Some people say we aren't responsible for that. Is there the Supreme Court says there is some responsibility. What about yourself? And Gard, what about yourself? Is there any responsibility?
Well, Ramadan, I think they know that they're responsible. That's why they covered it up for so long. Mm-hmm. You know, they hid it. It was the largest number of black townships after the Civil War between 1865 and 1920. They found dozens of black townships and settlements in that region. They had black landowners who had purchased the 40 acres of land in Tulsa, naming it after the Greenwood, Mississippi. And so there was a Mr. Gurley. He was credited with having the first black business in Greenwood in 1906. So, of course, they have some responsibility. It was a self-contained and reliant, flourishing community. And again, when it was destroyed, it set African Americans back tremendously.
And for those who are listening, this is only one event. There were hundreds of events of depopulation, of ethnic cleansing, not only among African Americans, but among the Native American populations. And it makes note in this article about the 5 facts that the Tulsa police may have encouraged the violence, and there was an effort by Tulsa Tribune and the government to suppress the story. Truth and records in hospitals shows that over 800 people were admitted in local hospitals, yet the Oklahoma Bureau of Vital Statistics officially recorded only 30 dead. So we began to see that not only there was crimes, there was complicity, but there was an attempt to cover it up. Gard, how do we get the American population, in particular those who are in denial? How do we get that discussion, which I know you're involved in and you're constantly promoting through compassion, the dialogue? How do we amp that up and get more Americans involved to see the reality of our condition, what our historical experiences has been, and how do we move forward in the 21st century? What do we need?
Well, you've referred to the Supreme Court. I think you need a case. I think you need a test point. And I think Tulsa's, because of the publicity around Tulsa of recent years, it is probably the test case. And so I saw that there was a real estate swindle over on the beaches of Los Angeles that the city is starting to rectify. But I think Tulsa would be an incredible precedent for a larger conversation. Roe versus Wade, Brown versus the Department of Education. These are the kinds of cases that you need on the books. So again, it was 100 years ago that over 10% of the white male population of America, over 10%, were card-carrying members of the Ku Klux Klan. Mm-hmm. It was 100 years ago. And again, the Supreme Court is shifting sands. We've got a very conservative Supreme Court. We've got a lot of white people on that court. But it was 100 years ago that the Supreme Court said to a Japanese fellow and to a fellow from India, you can't be a U.S. citizen because your skin color is not the same as ours. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese fellow, whose name was O'Hara, said, if I put an apostrophe between the O and the H, I'm actually O'Hara. And it's funny, but it's sad that the Supreme Court itself has been a locus of that kind of bigotry, bias, and prejudice. Mm-hmm. And so again, when we talked about integration back in the 50s, then President Eisenhower said, we've got to start this conversation, we've got to start this education in the early grades, and we've got to move it forward each year progressively. And that's why I think that critical race theory, whatever you want to call it, the labels don't matter. But what we need to have in our educational system is a clear understanding of systemic racism, and it needs to be taught early on so the kids begin to understand it. And then when they get to be in a place where they could be a Supreme Court justice, they're going to do something. But I think Tulsa would be the test case right now.
Good, and thank you for that. Gard, you've introduced me to a book recently, Pro-Social, and it really highlights Lynn Ostrom's concept of what I would call economic justice, but she calls a sharing of wealth. And she won the 2009 Nobel Prize in Economy. I think she's the first woman to win that. Does her insights into these ideas economically fit into the social justice concept, and particularly with economics?
Absolutely. She speaks about the tragedy of the commons, and classical economic theory, if you take Econ 101, you learn from The Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith that his theory is based upon selfishness. But if you add systemic racism and selfishness and 10% of the population being card-carrying members of the KKK, you've got the formula for an ongoing deprivation, an ongoing inequality and disparity within the system. So Eleanor Ostrom really provides us with some very core principles of how to understand economic benefit and how economic benefit should be distributed fairly, so you avoid what's called the tragedy of the commons, where people take advantage of a limited resource. And that's part of the issue of our economic theory, is that we only have limited resources, but we have unlimited greed, and our economic theory is based upon that economic greed and selfishness. Mm-hmm. So we've got to begin to reverse the consciousness. As Einstein said, you can't solve the problem with the same level of consciousness that created it. So as you and I have talked, we need to elevate that quality of consciousness which comes through education.
Dora, what does African Americans need to do ourselves to show the responsibility of developing an economic legacy that we can leave to our children? What are some of the things that we can specifically focus on ourselves?
So one of the things that stood out to me when I was reading about the Tulsa massacre, Ramadan, is that, you had luxury shops, restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, you had everything. And what stood out to me most of all was that every dollar spent in that community changed hands 19 times before it left that community. That's what happens with the Asian community and the Hispanic community and their businesses. And until we get to that point in all of those socioeconomic indicators that I talked about earlier that we're last in, we will continue to be last in.
Good. And I know you've constantly been, you often use the term the devil's advocate, because many times our people don't want to hear that. But I appreciate you constantly being the champion for pushing it and then having the information to back it up. Hakan, your relationship with Hizmet and Sheikh Julian and the work that you're doing, not only, I'm sure, in the United Kingdom, but through Silver Sage Foundation here in Southern Nevada and Las Vegas, Nevada. We're doing tremendous work in economics. We're doing work with people on the other end of the extreme who are incarcerated. What is it that drives Hizmet to social justice and bringing about parity among ethnic groups and people getting to know one another? And we actually have the leader, or the philosophical leader of Hizmet, actually resides here in the United States. Mohammed Julan in Pennsylvania. And so we're honored having him in the United States and the insights that he brings to balancing the social justice agenda. What is it that his message promotes that gives an idea that this could be a help in terms of resolving this problem that we're discussing here today?
Well, Said Nursi passed away in 1960, but he set out the blueprint. He didn't have a chance to realize the projects. 3 problems and 3 solutions: education, wealth creation, and dialogue. So it was the idea was out there. But luckily, Fethullah Gülen, who is one of your fellow Americans residing in Pennsylvania, he started implementing Nursi's ideas back in 1969. And what he did, I was quite impressed because I could see the product of his work. He brought down accessible education to the most disadvantaged people. He started off in Turkey, as I said, late 60s, early 70s. I was quite surprised to see people, holding the high office, such as judiciary, the police, the army, or, wealthy businesses, all coming from very poor background. I was surprised. I asked them how. They said, look, thanks to the movement, education was made accessible to us. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have telephone connections in our village, but these people, they brought us out of that poverty. They, gave us education. Then we moved to the universities and, we caught up with, we don't have this black-white disparity in Turkey when Hizmet started, but we had, wealthy white Turkish people and poor, not so white Kurdish people, more or less the same problem. But Gülen's movement successfully brought the less advantaged people to the same level as an ordinary people. And I think it has achieved quite a lot. And in 1990, with the collapse of Soviet Union, Gülen sent his teachers and people to Central Asia, and from there, all across the world. And the idea is that wherever you go, you treat everybody equally, and you make sure everybody has equal access to good education, because that's a good starting point. Mm-hmm. So with a good education, you're going to see these people not in poverty, not in, continuous violence and drugs and, low-level crime. Mm-hmm. You're going to bring them up to the national standards. And Gülen's movement, Hizmet movement, has actually achieved this quite successfully. And I'm quite pleased to tell that they are working really hard in the U.S. They have, I don't know how many schools, charter schools. The philosophy is there. Hold the hand of the poorest in the community. Hold the hands of the, least advantaged person and bring him up. So give them education so that they can earn decent living and become a part of society.
Well, we're certainly seeing it even as far as the criminal justice system, and thank you for that sharing. Gard, how important is discussion around compassion because economics and compassion, is there a compatible discussion there? How important is it for us to approach this with a compassionate understanding of one another?
Well, I will tell you, I was on a call with Dennis Snow, who is an advisor to the G20, and these are all the developed nations of the world. And he is now writing about how important compassion is in understanding economics and economic equality. And so I think there is a shift going on, and I think people have underestimated the power of compassion. Mm-hmm. As the Dalai Lama said, this is not a luxury, this is a necessity. This is not a sign of weakness, this is a sign of strength. And so as we begin to move compassion, which, as you know, we're doing in the social justice arena by actually asking the legislators and the powers that be in Nevada to bring restorative justice, which has never been in Nevada, mm-hmm. as a formal plank of criminal justice, to bring restorative justice, which is compassion in criminal justice, into our formal system. And so there's a shift going on, and it's exciting to see, and it's exciting to be alive right now to see it happening.
Good. I'm glad to see it, be a part of it, and we thank you for your leadership there. Dora, you've been a voice and an advocate for this, and one last book I'd like to mention to our reading audience that I researched for this discussion was The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America by Sean Rochester, and I strongly suggest that you go out and get a copy of this book and read it. Dora, any final comments on your part?
No, I don't have any final comments, but I'm going to say this. Compassion in criminal justice is going to be totally different than compassion in economic justice because we're talking about competition.
Okay, good.
And there's a fight to maintain their level of authority.
Right. Well, we thank all of you for listening in today. Hakan for yourself, Gard Jameson for yourself, and to our listening audience, we appreciate you taking time out to listen, and we hope through interfaith and intercultural dialogues that you're more informed. We'll have these gifts back on for other discussions. So thank you for listening in. We appreciate you, and we look forward to talking to you the first Saturday of next month on Interfaith Intercultural Dialogue. Thank you all so very much. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you all.